The scroll arrived before we even had time to be afraid. I was sitting in the third row of the United Nations Emergency Assembly when the herald transmitted it. Not through radio, not through any signal we had a name for. It simply appeared on every screen in the building at once, formatted in clean, perfect English, as if someone had spent considerable time making sure we would not have the excuse of translation errors. The document was 41 pages long. The title was printed at the top in letters that were calm and absolute. Terms of accession to the Galactic Empire, effective upon signature. My name is Oliver Grant. I was 34 years old, a diplomatic liaison officer with 8 years of experience navigating arguments between nations that shared a planet. I had never, in any of my training, been given a module on how to say no to something that had crossed the void between stars to hand us paperwork. The ship had appeared 2 hours earlier. It materialized in low orbit without a sound, without a warning, without a single communication preceding its arrival. Our tracking stations picked it up on radar as a shape so large the system initially flagged it as a sensor malfunction. It was roughly 4 kilometers long. It had no visible weapons, which our analysts spent those 2 hours deciding was either very reassuring or very frightening, and they could not reach a consensus. The assembly hall was standing room only. Ambassadors sat pressed shoulder to shoulder. Aides lined the walls. Outside the building, 3 blocks of Midtown Manhattan had been evacuated, though no one had explained to the public exactly why. The official statement called it a precautionary security measure. Everyone with a phone and a window could see the shadow the ship cast across the Hudson. The herald himself appeared on our screens 17 minutes after the scroll. He was tall, pale in the way that suggested his species had not seen unfiltered sunlight in a very long time, and dressed in something between a uniform and a formal coat. His face was structured differently from ours. The proportions were close enough that looking at him was not alarming, but just different enough that you kept noticing it. He had no eyebrows. His eyes were a very light gray, almost silver, and they moved with a precision that reminded me of a camera lens adjusting its focus. His English was perfect. Not accented. Not translated sounding. Perfect. The way a language sounds when someone has studied 10,000 hours of recordings and absorbed every rhythm of it. He said his name was Emissary Varan, representative of the eternal throne of the Galactic Empire, and that he brought with him the traditional offer of civilization and belonging. He said the Empire currently governed 612 worlds across 4 star systems, and that Earth would be the 613th, which was considered an auspicious number in imperial tradition. He said the process was simple, that the terms in the scroll were standard, that every world that had received this offer had accepted within 48 hours, and that his schedule allowed for a brief question period before the signing ceremony. He was not unkind about it. That was the thing I kept coming back to in the hours that followed. He was not threatening. He was not arrogant in the way a bully is arrogant. He was simply certain, the way a person is certain of gravity, because in his entire experience, there had never been a reason to be anything else. I watched the senior ambassadors read the scroll in real time. I had a copy on the tablet in my hands. I read it alongside them. The terms were, in the most precise sense of the word, thorough. Earth's natural resources would enter the imperial registry and become subject to extraction quotas determined by a planetary governor appointed by the throne. We would retain local administrative councils for day-to-day municipal matters, meaning roads and sewage and neighborhood disputes, while all decisions above that level would route through imperial governance. Every human between the ages of 18 and 35 who met the physical criteria would be eligible for conscription into imperial military service, with tours of a minimum of 8 years. Our cultural output, meaning our literature, our music, our art, our philosophy, would be archived, studied, and preserved. But new cultural production would require a licensing process to ensure alignment with imperial standards of communication. There was a section on language. Within 2 generations, the primary language of instruction on Earth would shift to imperial standard, which Varan had helpfully included as an appendix. English, Mandarin, Arabic, Spanish, and the other languages of Earth would be classified as regional dialects and permitted in informal use. There was a section on religion. There was a section on governance of scientific research. There was a section on reproduction, which I read twice because I was not initially certain I had understood it correctly, and then read a third time because I had. The ambassador from Germany, a careful and patient woman named Claudia Werner, was the first senior diplomat to put down her tablet. She set it on the table very gently, the way you set something down when you are concentrating very hard on remaining composed. She folded her hands. She looked at the screen where Varan's image waited with the polite patience of someone who had done this many times before and knew how the next part went. She said, in a voice that was entirely level, "We will need to deliberate." Varan said that was perfectly reasonable, and that he would return to the channel in 6 hours. The screen went dark. For approximately 4 seconds, the assembly hall was completely silent. Then everyone began talking at once, and the noise was considerable. I spent those 6 hours running between meeting rooms, carrying physical printouts because several of the ambassadors did not trust the building's network, listening to conversations that ranged from technical analysis to something very close to controlled panic. The military advisors who had been brought in were focused on the ship's orbital position and what it could reach from there. The scientists were focused on the propulsion signature and what it implied about capabilities we did not have. The economists were focused on the resource extraction clauses and running numbers that made their faces go pale. Nobody, in any of those rooms, was talking about signing. I noticed that. I made a note of it. When Varan's image returned to the screen 6 hours later, exactly on schedule, the assembly hall had reorganized itself into something that looked like a formal session. The Secretary General of the United Nations, a man named George Hartwell, was seated at the primary table. He was 61 years old, had been in international diplomacy for 30 years, and had the particular stillness of someone who had decided, before entering the room, exactly what he was going to say. Varan greeted him pleasantly and asked if Earth was prepared to proceed with the signing. George Hartwell said, in measured and courteous English, that after careful review and extensive deliberation among the representatives of Earth's governments, Earth's collective position was as follows. We were grateful for the contact, we found much of the imperial civilization genuinely impressive, and we wished the Empire and its member worlds every success. However, the terms as presented were not acceptable to us, and we would not be signing the accession scroll. Varan's expression did not change. His camera lens eyes adjusted their focus slightly. He asked if there was a specific section we wished to discuss. George Hartwell said that it was not a matter of specific sections. It was a matter of the fundamental nature of the agreement, which did not preserve human sovereignty, self-determination, or cultural integrity. Earth's position was that we were open to a relationship with the Empire, but not this relationship, and not on these terms. Varan was quiet for a moment. It was not a comfortable quiet. It was the quiet of a very sophisticated system encountering an input it did not have a processing pathway for. He said he was not certain he understood. George Hartwell, with the patience of a man who had spent 3 decades in rooms where people pretended not to understand things, repeated himself clearly and without irritation. Varan said he would need to relay this to the throne, and that he hoped Earth would reconsider in the interim, because the throne was not accustomed to extended negotiations at this stage. George Hartwell said that was perfectly fine, and that Earth would be available to discuss a revised framework whenever the Empire was ready to offer one. The screen went dark again. I was standing near the back wall. Around me, people were very still, the way people go still when they have just watched something happen that they do not yet have the words for. It occurred to me, standing there, that Emissary Varan had arrived on a ship 4 kilometers long, representing an empire of 612 worlds, carrying a document with 41 pages of terms, and the entire machinery of that enormous, ancient, interstellar civilization had just encountered something it had never designed a response for. We had said no. Not in anger, not with a threat, not with a military posture or a dramatic speech. With a polite, grammatically correct, diplomatically measured no, delivered by a 61-year-old civil servant in a conference room in Manhattan. I looked around at the faces of the assembled diplomats and aides and analysts, and what I saw was not fear. What I saw was something I recognized from years of watching negotiations, from watching people across a table realize that the other side was not going to fold. It was the specific, quiet energy of people who had just decided something, and meant it. Outside, the ship was still there. Its shadow still fell across the river. Nothing had changed in orbit, but something had changed in that room, something that, I suspected, would take the Empire a while to understand. We had just handed the most powerful civilization in the known galaxy its first experience of the word no, and we had done it before lunch on a Tuesday, and nobody in that room was going to apologize for it. I folded my copy of the scroll, put it in my jacket pocket, and went to find coffee. There was going to be a lot of work ahead, and I had a feeling it was going to be the most interesting work of my life. The silence from the Empire lasted 19 days. Not complete silence. Varan's ship remained in orbit, visible every clear night as a point of light that moved too deliberately across the sky to be a satellite. Our instruments tracked it constantly. It did not change position. It did not power any weapons, at least none that our sensors could identify. It simply waited, the way something waits when it is confident that waiting is all it needs to do. On the 20th day, a second ship arrived. It was smaller than the first, which is to say it was approximately the size of an aircraft carrier, and it came with an escort of 6 vessels that our military analysts immediately began arguing about. 3 of the escort ships were clearly armed. The other 3 were not clearly anything, which was its own kind of answer. Varan returned to the screens that afternoon. He was dressed slightly differently, in something with more formal ornamentation, and his opening statement was longer than his first one had been. He said the Eternal Throne had reviewed Earth's response with great interest and wished to open a constructive dialogue. He said the throne recognized that Earth was a young civilization with strong local traditions, and that certain accommodations might be possible within the standard framework. He said the throne was prepared to discuss a modified conscription schedule and certain cultural preservation guarantees. What the throne was not prepared to discuss, he said carefully, was the fundamental structure of accession, because that structure was the foundation upon which 612 successful integrations had been built, and the throne did not believe it would serve Earth's interests to be treated as an exception. I was in a smaller room this time, watching on a monitor with 6 other people, including a woman named Caroline Finch, who was the lead analyst for our newly formed Alien Affairs Division, a department that had not existed a month ago, and currently operated out of a converted storage room on the 4th floor. Caroline had not slept properly since first contact. She had the focused, slightly hollow look of someone running on intelligence and caffeine, and she was the most useful person in the building. She watched Varan's statement with her arms crossed and a pen tapping slowly against her elbow. When he finished, she said, "He used the word accommodations 3 times and the word exception once. They've had internal disagreement about this. Someone up there pushed back on the standard approach. I asked her what that meant. She said it meant we were not dealing with a monolith. We were dealing with a system that had internal politics, and internal politics meant there were people within that system who thought the standard approach to Earth was a mistake. That was useful. That was a pressure point, if we could find it." George Hartwell's response to Varan's second overture was similarly courteous and similarly firm. Earth appreciated the throne's willingness to discuss modifications. Earth's position remained that modifications within the existing framework were not sufficient, because the existing framework did not begin from a premise of equal standing, and equal standing was not a negotiating item. It was a precondition. Varan looked at George Hartwell for a long moment after this was delivered. Then he said something that was not in the diplomatic script, something that felt personal in a way his previous statements had not been. He said, "You do understand what you are declining." George Hartwell said yes, he did. Varan said, 612 worlds, resources, technology, protection, access to a civilization that spans 4 star systems. You are declining all of that. George Hartwell said yes, they were, if it came with the terms attached. Varan said nothing further. The channel closed. Caroline set down her pen. She picked up her coffee mug, found it empty, and set it back down. "He's going to take that personally," she said. She was right. We found out later, much later, that the exchange had been transmitted directly to the throne within minutes of it happening, and that the Emperor's first response upon reviewing it had been to ask his advisors whether the translation was accurate. They confirmed that it was. He then asked whether Earth was aware of what it was declining. They confirmed that we had been clearly informed. The Emperor, according to the account that eventually reached us through channels I will explain later, had then gone quiet for a very long time. The people in the room with him described it as the specific quiet of someone recalculating something fundamental. On Earth, we did not know any of that yet. What we knew was that the second ship and its escort remained in orbit alongside the first, and that our governments were doing 2 things simultaneously, continuing to engage diplomatically through Varan's channel, and quietly, urgently preparing for the possibility that diplomacy was not going to be what resolved this. I was part of a small working group tasked with understanding the Empire's decision-making structure. We had the 41-page scroll, we had Varan's 3 communications, and we had 17 days of signal analysis from our listening stations, which had been pointing every instrument we had at those ships since the moment they appeared. The signal analysis team was led by a man named Owen Clark, a former radio astronomer who had been pulled from his university position and driven to a facility in Virginia that he was not permitted to tell his wife the location of. Owen was quiet, precise, and deeply interested in patterns. He had spent the previous 2 weeks doing something that was, on the surface, absurdly simple. He had been listening to the communication rhythm between the ships in orbit and whatever was on the other end of their signals, and mapping the delays. The delays told him something. If a signal left a ship and a response came back in 11 hours, that set a floor on how far away the source was. If the ship sent something and the response came in 43 minutes, that was a different calculation. Over 17 days of continuous monitoring, Owen had built a map of communication rhythms that suggested the Empire's nearest major installation was not in our solar system, but was not impossibly far from it either. He had also noticed that the frequency of communications had increased significantly after our second refusal. The ships in orbit were talking to someone a great deal more than they had been before. Owen spread his maps across the table and said simply, "They're surprised. Whoever they're reporting to, those reports are generating a lot of conversation. They expected this to be done by now." That was when I understood, clearly and completely, what we had actually done by saying no. We had not simply declined an offer. We had disrupted a process that had never been disrupted before. 612 times, this machinery had run its course without a deviation. The scroll arrived. The scroll was signed. The ship moved on. The new world was absorbed, and the Empire continued, steady and enormous, and utterly certain of itself. We had introduced a variable that the machinery had no subroutine for. And the machinery was now talking to itself a great deal, trying to figure out what to do about us. The third overture came 31 days after the first contact. This time, there were 4 ships in orbit. The new arrivals were larger than the escort vessels, and they arranged themselves in a pattern that our military analysts identified, after some debate, as a loose blockade formation. Not a threatening posture exactly, but a present one, a reminder. Varen's message this time was shorter, and noticeably less warm. He said the throne wished to inform Earth that the current situation was unusual, that the throne's patience was a significant gift, and that continued refusal would necessitate a reconsideration of Earth's status, from potential member world to unaffiliated territory, which carried different implications for how the Empire would interact with us going forward. George Hartwell asked, pleasantly, what those implications were. Varen said trade, technology sharing, and any form of diplomatic relationship would require formal imperial approval on a case-by-case basis, and that unaffiliated territories were not extended any of the protections afforded to member worlds. George Hartwell said he understood, and asked whether unaffiliated territories were subject to any obligations to the Empire. Varen said no. George Hartwell said that sounded like precisely the arrangement Earth had been proposing from the beginning, and that we were glad to hear the Empire was open to it. There was a pause. It was a long pause. Caroline, watching beside me, pressed her lips together to suppress something that was almost a smile. Varen said that was not what he had meant, and that he would be in contact again shortly. The channel closed. The blockade formation tightened slightly over the following week. 2 more ships appeared. Our weather satellites required adjustment because 3 of the new vessels were interfering with their orbital paths, and the technicians who handled those adjustments filed the paperwork with a thoroughness that suggested they were aware they were filing historical documents. Across Earth, the public was watching the sky. They had been watching the sky since the first ship appeared, because you cannot hide a 4-kilometer vessel in low orbit from 8 billion people with smartphones. The governments had been careful in their communications, factual and measured, releasing information in controlled amounts. But the orbital arrangement was visible to amateur astronomers from any clear sky on the planet, and the amateur astronomers were posting what they saw, and what they saw was a ring of ships drawing slowly tighter around the world. What the public was not doing, in the majority, was panicking. This surprised a great many analysts. The psychological models for public response to first contact had generally predicted significant social disruption. What they had not predicted was the particular stubbornness of a species that has a cultural memory of blockades, of sieges, of being told by external forces that resistance was pointless, and responding with something between fury and determination that tends to look, from the outside, like calm. I saw it in the streets when I walked to work in the morning. People going about their lives with an awareness in their eyes that was not fear. Something harder than fear. Something that had been in the species for a very long time, and came out when it was needed. There were protests, some of them quite loud, from groups who believed we should sign the scroll and take what benefits we could from imperial membership. There were counter-protests from groups who believed we should be more aggressive in our refusals. There were philosophers and politicians and ordinary people arguing in every public forum available about what it meant to be human and what we owed ourselves and what we were prepared to lose. It was messy, it was complicated, it was, in its way, gloriously, frustratingly, typically human. And somewhere above all of it, more ships arrived. The fleet grew to 14 vessels over the following 3 weeks. They did not fire anything. They did not jam our communications. They did not make any move that could be called an act of force. They simply increased in number, which was itself a statement, delivered in the language of mass and tonnage and the darkness of their shadows passing over our cities. On the 48th day since first contact, the Emperor's personal herald sent a message that did not go through Varan. It came through a different channel, one that appeared without warning on a frequency our analysts had been monitoring but not expecting to be used. The message was addressed not to any government, not to the United Nations, but to the people of Earth directly. It was broadcast simultaneously on every major communications band we used, which meant every radio, every television, every internet-connected device received it at the same moment. The Emperor said that he had watched our deliberations with great interest. He said he admired what he described as our spirit. He said that in 400 years of guiding the Empire's expansion, he had never encountered a world quite like ours, and that this was meant as a sincere compliment. He said the Empire was not our enemy. He said the Empire offered something of profound value, and he was saddened that fear was preventing us from receiving it. He said he was patient. He said we had more time to reconsider. He said that no world had ever remained outside the Empire permanently, and that he hoped our time as an exception would be brief. 8 billion people heard that message. The response that emerged from those 8 billion people, filtering through their governments and their media and their representatives, was not what the Emperor had expected. It was not softened by his compliments. It was not moved by his patience. It was not reassured by his framing of the Empire as a gift. What 8 billion people heard, when they stripped the courteous language down to its bones, was, "We are here, we are not leaving, and you will eventually come around." And what 8 billion people felt in response to that was something old and specific and deeply familiar, something that had shaped every chapter of human history from the very beginning. It was the particular human response to being told that resistance was futile. I was in my apartment that night, watching the city through my window. The sky above was clear. I could see 3 of the Imperial ships as points of light, brighter than the stars, moving in slow, deliberate arcs. My phone was full of messages. News alerts, colleague updates, a message from my mother in Edinburgh asking if I was safe, a message from a university friend named Daniel Pierce, who was a journalist and had been trying to get me on record for 6 weeks. I did not answer any of them that night. I stood at the window and thought about what it meant that the most powerful emperor in the known galaxy had just made a personal broadcast to Earth, and that the effect of it had been to make people angrier than they were before, and more certain, not less. I thought about what Caroline had said weeks ago. He's going to take that personally. She had been right, and I was beginning to understand that this was actually the most important development so far, because an emperor who was taking something personally was an emperor who had stopped thinking clearly about it, and an emperor who had stopped thinking clearly about us was going to keep making mistakes. I went to bed. I slept better than I had in weeks. In the morning, there was a lot of work to do. On the 53rd day of first contact, Owen Clark walked into my office, set a folder on my desk without saying anything, and sat down in the chair across from me. I opened the folder. Inside was a map. It was hand-drawn, which was unusual for Owen, who normally produced his work in precise digital formats. This one was on paper, in pencil, which told me he had drawn it quickly, somewhere he did not have access to a screen. The map showed the solar system. Earth was at the center. The 14 Imperial ships in orbit were marked with small circles, each one numbered and dated to indicate when it had arrived. Lines extended from each ship, annotated with signal delay measurements, orbital angles, and a set of calculations in Owen's small, careful handwriting that traced the geometry of the fleet's communication patterns back to a point of origin. The point of origin was marked with a question mark and a set of coordinates. Owen said, "That is where they're talking to. Not the home system, nothing that far. A relay station, probably. But it is a fixed point. It has been a fixed point for the entire duration of their presence here, and those are its coordinates, to within a margin of error I am comfortable with." I looked at the numbers. I said, "You mapped an Imperial installation from Earth." Owen said, "With 53 days of radio astronomy data, yes. It is not precise enough to navigate to, but it is precise enough to know it exists and approximately where." I asked him who else had seen this. He said just me. He had walked directly from his workstation to my office. He had not sent the data over any network. I told him to keep it that way for the next 24 hours, and then I went to find Caroline. Caroline read the folder in 4 minutes. Then she sat back and was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was building something in her head. She said, "They don't know we can do this." I said, "They don't know we've been doing this." She said, "Since day one." I said, "Since day one." She smiled. It was a tired smile, but it was real. She said, "They've been watching us. They've been studying us. And the entire time, we've been studying them." That was the truth of it. From the moment the first ship appeared, Every scientific instrument on the planet had been pointed at the sky, not in a coordinated, government-directed way, not initially. Individual observatories, university research stations, amateur astronomers, military listening posts, all of them watching, recording, analyzing, sharing data through networks that the Empire either did not know existed or had not thought to consider important. The data had been flowing for 53 days, and what it had produced, in aggregate, was not just Owen's relay station map. Caroline took me through what her team had compiled over the previous week. The propulsion signature of the Imperial ships used a specific type of field generation that our physicists had been modeling for 31 days. They did not understand it fully. They were nowhere near replicating it, but they understood its parameters well enough to calculate its energy requirements, which meant they understood something about the power systems on those ships, which meant they understood something about the ship's operational limits. The communication encryption used by the Imperial fleet was not cracked. That would have been extraordinary. But the structure of the encrypted signals, the rhythm and the packet sizing and the frequency distribution had been mapped thoroughly enough that our analysts could identify different types of transmissions. Command traffic looked different from routine status reports. Emergency signaling looked different from standard check-ins. Caroline's team had been building a behavioral dictionary for 7 weeks. The fleet's orbital pattern had been analyzed by 6 independent groups of physicists and aerospace engineers, 3 government-funded and 3 from universities, and all 6 had reached the same conclusion about which ships were capital vessels, which were support, and which were communications relays. We had been studying them, carefully, quietly, persistently, from our own planet, using our own tools and the collective intelligence of a species that responds to a problem by pointing every available mind at it and comparing notes. And they did not know. Because it had not occurred to them that we would, because every other civilization they had encountered had been so overwhelmed by first contact that the idea of that civilization turning around and conducting systematic research on the Imperial fleet would have seemed absurd. Because the assumption embedded in the entire Imperial approach to new worlds was that the new world was the subject of study, not the other way around. We had reversed the equation, and they had not noticed. Caroline said, "We need to take this to Hartwell, all of it." I said, "Today." She said, "Right now." We went. George Hartwell listened to the full briefing for 90 minutes. He asked precise questions and listened carefully to the answers. When we were done, he was quiet for a long time, looking at Owen's hand-drawn map. Then he asked Caroline what she recommended. She said she recommended that we did not reveal what we knew, that we continue engaging with Varan exactly as we had been, maintaining the same measured diplomatic tone, that we use what we had learned to inform our negotiating positions without letting the Empire know the information existed, and that we accelerate the research, bring in more people carefully and quietly, and extend the mapping and analysis as far as it could go. She said, "Right now they think they know everything about us, and we know almost nothing about them. If we let them keep thinking that, we control what they don't know, and what they don't know is the most useful thing we have." George Hartwell nodded slowly. He said, "What else do we have?" That question opened a different kind of meeting. Over the following 3 days, I sat in a series of rooms with people I had not previously known existed, hearing things I was not certain I was cleared to hear, and building a picture of what Earth had been doing in the 53 days since the first ship arrived. The resource extraction problem. The accession terms had included imperial quotas over Earth's minerals, energy sources, and agricultural output. Within 2 weeks of first contact, the governments of every major industrial nation had quietly convened working groups to model what those quotas would actually mean, and more importantly, what it would mean to operate without imperial access to trade routes that we did not yet have, and resources we had not yet located. The modeling had produced an unexpected result. The scenario of long-term imperial blockade, the very scenario we were now beginning to live in, had been run in simulation by 3 separate economic teams, and all 3 had concluded the same thing. It was survivable. Difficult, requiring significant domestic transformation, but survivable. The asteroid belt contained mineral resources that we had barely begun to assess. Fusion technology, which had been frustratingly close to practical for decades, had received more focused engineering attention in the 7 weeks since first contact than it had in the previous 20 years, because the people working on it now had a specific and urgent reason to finish. The planetary governor problem. The accession terms had described imperial governance replacing national governments for any decision above the municipal level. Our political scientists had spent 3 weeks mapping exactly what that meant in practice, and their conclusion was that it effectively made the combined history of human political development irrelevant overnight. Every structure we had built, every legal tradition, every democratic institution, every form of self-governance that human civilization had developed across thousands of years would be subordinated to a single imperial administrative layer. The people in those rooms did not find this acceptable. They found it specifically, personally unacceptable in a way that went beyond strategy and into something more fundamental. I watched a constitutional scholar named Philip Morrow, who was ordinarily a quiet and methodical academic, become quite direct when describing his view of the matter. He said that whatever the empire offered in return, it was not worth the cost of becoming a planet that could not govern itself. He said it with the certainty of someone who had thought about little else for 7 weeks. The military situation. This was the room I found hardest to sit in, because what the defense analysts were describing was a gap that was, in honest terms, enormous. The Imperial fleet in orbit could, by the calculations available to us, do a great deal of damage to anything on the planet's surface if it chose to. Our own capabilities for responding to that threat were limited. The analysts knew this. They were not pretending otherwise. What they were doing, and had been doing since day 4 of first contact, was working on the gap from every angle they could find. The propulsion signature data Owen had accumulated was being fed to engineering teams. The communication mapping Caroline's group had done was being used to model the fleet's coordination patterns, which mattered, because a fleet that could not communicate could not coordinate, and a fleet that could not coordinate lost most of its advantages. The orbital positions of the ships had been analyzed for vulnerabilities by people whose job it was to think about that kind of thing. None of it was a solution. All of it was preparation. And then there was the thing that I had not expected, which was what had been happening outside the government rooms entirely. I learned about it from a woman named Helen Park, who was an economist by training but had been working for the past 4 weeks as a liaison between the official diplomatic effort and something she described, with a slight air of wonder, as the informal response network. What had happened, Helen told me, was simple and enormous. Ordinary people had started organizing, not in a panicked way and not in a single direction. Scientists had formed working groups through their existing professional networks and were sharing analysis of everything the Empire had transmitted. Engineers were collaborating across borders on technology problems that the Imperial presence had suddenly made urgent. Writers, historians, and philosophers were producing work at a remarkable pace, much of it addressing the question of what human civilization actually was, and what it was worth preserving. The Imperial fleet had been watched from every ground-based telescope on Earth. The data had been shared openly, by enthusiasts and professionals alike, through existing academic and amateur networks. Owen's relay station map had, in a sense, been assembled from 1,000 separate observations by people who did not know each other and had never met, coordinated entirely by the human habit of posting what you find. Helen said, "They looked at the ship and they assumed we would be overwhelmed. They expected a civilization that would look up, see something so far beyond us, and collapse inward. And instead what happened was that 8 billion people looked up and got curious." I said, "And angry." She said, "That too. In roughly equal measure." The curiosity mattered more than the anger, in the long run. Anger gives you energy. Curiosity gives you direction. On the 61st day, the blockade tightened. 2 more ships arrived, bringing the total to 16. They adjusted their orbital configuration, and the new pattern was denser, clearly designed to be visible from the ground. Our weather data took a measurable hit as the ships disrupted certain satellite trajectories. The disruption was not severe enough to cause immediate problems, but it was enough to register, and registering was the point. Varin sent a message that day that was brief and factual. He said the Eternal Throne had concluded that Earth's continued refusal to engage with the accession framework was not a product of genuine disagreement with the terms, but of cultural misunderstanding that required time to resolve. The fleet would remain in its current configuration while Earth's leadership undertook further reflection. He said the throne was, as always, patient. I wrote my response to Varin's message that afternoon, drafted it carefully through the proper channels, and it was approved by George Hartwell and sent that evening. It said that Earth had not misunderstood the terms. It said that Earth's position remained as stated. It said that we hoped the Empire would find value in a relationship built on mutual respect rather than absorption, and that we remained open to discussing a framework that began from that premise. Varin did not respond for 11 days. During those 11 days, something happened that none of our models had predicted. The Imperial ships in orbit began receiving signals from Earth that were not official government communications. They were coming from private transmitters, amateur radio operators, university stations, individual researchers. The signals were not aggressive. They were not coded. They were, in the most precise sense, communication. People asking questions. People sending music. People transmitting mathematical sequences and scientific data and, in several cases, long and carefully composed descriptions of what life on Earth was like. The Empire could not ignore them. The volume was too large and the variety too wide. Hundreds of simultaneous private transmissions going up to those ships every day. And the ships began, very quietly, to respond. Not officially, not through Varen's channel. Individual officers, it appeared, were replying to individual transmitters. The exchanges were cautious at first, brief, but they were happening. Caroline heard about this on day 3 of it and spent 2 full days reading the transcripts. Then she walked into my office looking like someone who had just found something she had been searching for, without knowing she was searching. She said, "They're curious about us too." She put a transcript on my desk. It was an exchange between an amateur radio operator in New Zealand named Gary Whitmore and someone on the lead Imperial ship who had identified themselves only by a designator number, who had been asking Gary questions about New Zealand's geography for 40 minutes. I read it twice. I said, "The officers are not a monolith either." She said, "No. And whoever is on those ships has been up there for 2 months watching a planet that keeps saying no and keeps organizing and keeps looking up. I think some of them have questions." On the 72nd day, I received a message through an unofficial channel, not from Varen, from someone who identified themselves as a member of the Imperial Diplomatic Auxiliary, which I looked up and found to be the Empire's secondary diplomatic corps, distinct from the primary herald service. The message was short. It asked whether Earth would be open to an informal conversation about what a framework of mutual respect might actually look like in practice. I took it to George Hartwell. He read it 3 times. Then he asked me to set up the conversation. A door had opened, not the main door, not the official one. A side door, opened carefully, by someone on the Imperial side who had been watching for 2.5 months and had decided that the standard approach was not going to work on Earth. That conversation was the beginning of the next part, but that evening, before it started, I walked out of the building and stood in the street and looked at the sky. The ships were there, steady and enormous, and lit by the sun from an angle that made them visible even in the afternoon light. They had come here certain of the outcome. They had brought their scroll and their formations and their patience, and all of it had run into something they did not have a word for. A planet that studied its visitors while pretending to be studied. A civilization that responded to pressure by getting more organized. A species that, when told the situation was impossible, started looking for the part of it that was not. I went back inside. There was a conversation to prepare for. The room we used for the informal meeting was not a conference hall. It was a smaller space, a meeting room on the 7th floor with a long table, 8 chairs, and windows that looked out over the city rather than up at the sky. The choice was deliberate. George Hartwell had decided, after consideration, that conducting this conversation at eye level and in ordinary surroundings was itself a form of communication. The Imperial representative who had sent the message was named Devon Sorrell. He was not a herald, he was not a commander. He was a diplomat in the older sense of the word, which in the Empire meant something specific. He belonged to a corps that predated the current accession framework by several centuries, from a time when the Empire had been smaller, and had sometimes needed to negotiate rather than simply offer terms. The diplomatic auxiliary had been largely ceremonial for the past 100 years, their skills rarely required because the accession process had become so smooth and so reliable that negotiation was not a step it included. Devon Sorrell was, by Imperial standards, a relic. He was also, by any standard, extremely sharp. He came down from the ship alone, no escort, no herald, no formal ceremony. He was transported to the building in an ordinary vehicle, which he later told me he had specifically requested, and he walked into the meeting room carrying nothing except the kind of careful, neutral expression that takes years of practice to maintain. I was in the room with George Hartwell, Caroline, and 2 advisors. We had agreed to keep the group small. Davin looked at the group, looked at the room, and something in his expression shifted slightly. It was not quite surprise. It was more like recognition, like someone who had expected one thing and found another, and found the other slightly easier. He said before sitting down, "I should tell you that this conversation is not officially sanctioned by the Eternal Throne. I have not been instructed to have it. I have arranged it on the basis that there may be value in a discussion that does not carry the weight of official position, and that the current situation is not progressing in a direction that serves anyone's interests." George Hartwell said he appreciated the honesty, and that Earth was similarly approaching the conversation without specific mandate, as a preliminary exchange of views. They sat down. What followed was 3 hours that I have thought about many times since, because it was unlike any diplomatic exchange I had participated in before. The official conversations with Varen had a structure, a protocol, A set of expected positions and responses. They moved along a track, even when the content of them was difficult. This conversation had no track. Devon began by asking, not as a negotiating move but as what appeared to be genuine inquiry, what specifically had made Earth refuse the initial terms. He said he had read the transcript of the first session repeatedly, and he was puzzled by something. He understood the objections to the specific clauses. What he did not understand was the speed and certainty of the refusal. In his experience, civilizations that received the scroll spent their deliberation time weighing benefits against costs, and the benefits were significant. The technology access alone typically produced strong arguments for accession, even among populations that were uncomfortable with the governance terms. He said Earth had not appeared to weigh the benefits very carefully. We had looked at the terms and said no, with a speed that suggested the terms themselves were almost irrelevant. George Hartwell thought about this for a moment. He said, "That is a perceptive observation. You are correct that the speed of refusal was not primarily about the specific terms. It was about what the terms assumed." Devon asked what he meant. George Hartwell said, "The terms assumed that the appropriate relationship between Earth and the Empire was membership. Not partnership, not alliance, not exchange. Membership. The scroll describes a process of joining, not of connecting. And what the scroll made clear, from the first page, was that joining meant becoming something fundamentally different from what we are." Devon said, "Most worlds find that the transformation is worth the stability." George Hartwell said, "Most worlds may not have the particular relationship with self-determination that Earth does. Our history is, in many ways, a history of that question. Who governs? Who decides? Who has the right to determine the shape of a civilization? We have been arguing about it for thousands of years. We have not resolved it. But the act of arguing about it is itself something we would not give up." Devon was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that stopped the room. He said, "The Emperor has read everything we have transmitted about Earth. Every observation report, every cultural analysis, every behavioral study. He has read them personally, which is not something he typically does. He is not a passive administrator. He is genuinely interested." Caroline asked what the Emperor had made of what he read. Devon said, "He found Earth confusing in a way that he described as interesting. He said your civilization contains contradictions that should not be stable. You disagree with each other constantly and at considerable volume, and yet you produce. You have divided yourselves into hundreds of separate nations that sometimes actively harm each other, and yet as a species you have covered your planet and reached for the nearest celestial bodies." He said you reminded him of certain theoretical models in complexity science, systems that appear disordered but are actually operating at a level of emergent organization that is not immediately visible. I said, "He sounds like a scientist." Devon said, "He has been alive for 400 years. Over that time, you develop interests." There was a pause. George Hartwell said, "And what does he want from Earth? In terms that are honest, rather than official." Devon looked at the table for a moment, then he looked up. He said, "He wants to understand you. And he does not know how to do that without putting you inside the system he understands, which is the Empire. Outside the Empire, you are a variable. Inside it, you are comprehensible. He is not accustomed to variables." Caroline said, "That is a more honest answer than we have received in 72 days. Devon said, "I am aware." George Hartwell said, "Then let me give you an honest answer in return. Earth will not join the Empire. That is not a negotiating position. It is a fact about us that is as fixed as our geography. We cannot become something that is governed by someone else. It is not that we are unwilling, we are constitutionally incapable of it in any stable way. Any accession Earth signed would be contested from the moment of signing, and what the Emperor would get would not be a member world. It would be a permanent problem." Devon said, "I believe you." George Hartwell said, "Then what we need to discuss is not whether Earth joins the Empire, but what the relationship between a sovereign Earth and the Empire looks like. And I think, if you were sent here by someone who understands the situation, that this is why you are in this room." Devon looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Officially, I was not sent. Unofficially, yes. Someone who understands the situation sent me." George Hartwell said, "Then let us talk about what that relationship looks like." They talked for another 2 hours. The conversation did not produce an agreement. It was not supposed to. What it produced was a shared understanding that the current situation was stuck in a particular way, and that getting unstuck required something that the official process did not have, which was the ability to consider options that were not in the existing framework. Devon left the building that evening in the same ordinary vehicle. He returned to the ship. We did not hear from him through official channels. 3 days later, a message came through the same unofficial route. It said that the individual who had sent Devon had reviewed the conversation summary and wished to continue. George Hartwell asked me to respond. I sent back a single sentence. I said we were ready. Across the following 2 weeks, a series of informal conversations took place. Some of them involved Devon directly. Some of them were conducted through written exchanges. The topics moved from general principles to specific problems, from what a non-accession relationship would look like structurally to what it would require from both sides. I was in most of those conversations. I watched something happen that I did not have a name for at first, and then recognized as the specific dynamic of people who have been on opposite sides of something for a long time, carefully discovering that they are not opposites but different things, which is a much more productive starting point. The imperial representatives who participated in those conversations, which expanded slowly from Devon to include 2 others I will not name because they asked not to be named, were people who had spent their careers inside a system so large and so old that questioning it was not something they had ever found necessary or possible. Contact with Earth had, over 72 days, done something to some of them, given them a crack in the certainty. And on our side, I watched our own people do something that was difficult and necessary, which was to consider what we were actually asking for. Sovereignty was not an abstract principle. It had practical shapes. What did it mean in an interstellar context? What did a genuinely equal relationship between a galactic empire and a single planet even look like? What would we trade? What would we share? What would we refuse? Caroline's team produced a working document on the 3rd day of the informal talks. It was 70 pages long, precise and detailed, covering everything from resource exchange frameworks to technology sharing structures to cultural exchange protocols. It was the document of people who had been thinking carefully about this for weeks before the conversation started. Which is to say, it was the document of a civilization that had responded to first contact by immediately starting its homework. The imperial representatives received it and went quiet for 2 days. When Devon came back, he said, "The person I report to asked me to tell you that this document is more sophisticated than anything produced by a pre-accession civilization in the history of the empire." I said, "We have had a lot of time to think about it." He said, "You have had 72 days. I said, "Yes." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "I have been in diplomatic work for 60 years. I have never seen anything produced this quickly." I said, "We had good reason to be quick." The document became the basis for what happened next. Not immediately, not without significant conflict on the imperial side, which we learned about only in fragments over the following weeks, but it was the foundation, and the foundation was ours, built from our own thinking, on our own terms. On the 89th day of first contact, Varan requested a formal session. His tone in that request was different from anything he had previously sent. Careful in a new way, less certain. George Hartwell accepted. The session was the most important one yet, and it began with something that had never happened in any previous accession process. Varan arrived at the channel and said that the Eternal Throne had reviewed Earth's position and Earth's proposals, and wished to discuss a framework that was, in the Throne's assessment, without precedent. He said the word precedent with the particular flatness of someone repeating a word they have been told to use. George Hartwell said Earth was prepared to discuss a framework of equal partnership, and outlined the principles that would need to be at its foundation. I sat in the back of the room and watched the faces of the people around me. Someone was coming. That was the word that moved quietly through the room in the days after that session, though nobody said it officially. The unofficial conversations had produced enough movement on the imperial side that something had shifted at a level we could not directly observe. Someone was coming. 40 days later, the Emperor arrived. I was in the building when the escort fleet adjusted its formation, and everyone who had been doing anything else stopped doing it. The adjustment was visible on radar, visible to our tracking stations, and visible, if you knew what you were looking at, from the ground. The fleet was opening a corridor. A single ship descended, not the 4-kilometer Herald vessel, something smaller, faster, shaped differently. It came through the atmosphere at an angle that our air traffic systems had no category for, and it landed in the designated area that had been cleared outside the city, 3 kilometers from the building, on ground that had been prepared over the previous 6 days by a team who had been told only that a visitor of significant importance was expected. I was part of the reception group, 12 people, selected carefully, dressed in whatever our governments collectively decided was appropriate, which after 2 days of debate was ordinary formal wear, no uniforms, no ceremony. George Hartwell had decided that a throne room approach was wrong. An emperor who had never experienced an equal should experience what one looked like. What he experienced was a Tuesday morning in autumn, a slight wind, A row of 12 people standing on ordinary ground watching his ship settle into landing position, and no one bowing. I want to be precise about this. No one was rude. No one was aggressive. The reception was correct and formal and respectful. But there was no ceremony of submission, no posture of lesser before greater. And when the Emperor descended the ramp from his ship and looked at the 12 people waiting for him, what he saw was 12 people looking back. He was tall, taller than Varan, taller than Divan, taller than any of the imperial representatives we had met, and more physically imposing, in a way that was hard to separate from the 400 years of authority he carried with him. His clothing was extraordinary in a way that clothing rarely is. His face had the quality of something that had been a certain way for so long that it had forgotten it could be otherwise. He looked at the 12 of us for a long moment. Then he said, in English, which he had apparently studied since our first contact, "You are smaller than I expected." George Hartwell said, "We hear that often." The Emperor looked at him. Something moved in his expression that was very quick and might, in a different face, have been amusement. He said, "Take me inside." The building we used was, on his request, communicated through Davin, not the United Nations Assembly Hall. He did not want a stage. He wanted a room. We gave him a conference room on the 5th floor with a long table and 10 chairs and windows that looked at the city, and we gave him coffee because someone in the logistics team had learned that the Emperor had become aware of coffee during his study of Earth and was curious about it. He sat at the table. We sat at the table. He accepted the coffee, looked at it, and drank it with the focused attention of someone cataloging a new experience. Then he set the cup down and said, "I have been in this position before, not this specific situation, but the position of being in a room with something I do not fully understand." George Hartwell said, "What did you do in those situations?" The Emperor said, "I studied it until I did understand it. In most cases, that was sufficient. In some cases, what I learned was that the thing could not be fully understood from the outside." He looked at George Hartwell. He said, "I believe Earth may be the second type." George Hartwell said, "We are often difficult to understand from the inside as well." The Emperor said, "That is not a comfort to an administrator." George Hartwell said, "No, but it might be a comfort to a philosopher." There was a pause. The Emperor looked at the coffee cup. He said, "My advisors told me before I came that this meeting would produce one of two outcomes. Either Earth would agree to a modified accession, or I would leave and we would formalize a trade relationship, and I would accept that this particular world would remain outside my direct governance." They described those as the two available outcomes. George Hartwell said, "And which outcome do you anticipate?" The Emperor said, "I anticipate neither, because I think both of those outcomes were written by people who have not spent 90 days watching Earth." He looked around the table. He said, "What I have been watching is not a civilization preparing to be absorbed or preparing for conflict. What I have been watching is a civilization preparing for everything simultaneously, because that is what you do. You do not select a path and follow it. You pursue multiple paths at the same time, including contradictory ones, and you accept the resulting chaos because the chaos generates options." Caroline said, carefully, "Is that observation or criticism?" He looked at her. He said, "Observation, purely. After 400 years of managing predictable systems, I find the unpredictable ones interesting rather than threatening. This is perhaps a professional development." Something eased in the room. Not completely, but slightly. The next 8 hours were the most sustained and demanding conversation I have been part of. The Emperor did not negotiate in the way Varan had negotiated, which was to present established positions and await response. He questioned, he probed. He followed tangents with the persistence of someone who genuinely wanted to know where they led. He asked about human governance structures and why we had so many. He asked about our conflicts and how we recovered from them. He asked about what we valued more than stability, which was clearly something he found philosophically foreign. George Hartwell and Caroline and the other advisors answered carefully and honestly, without flattery and without apology. At one point, the Emperor asked me directly what I thought Earth would be willing to offer in a partnership arrangement. I said we could offer access, exchange, and collaboration. We could offer a trading partner that operated independently and therefore brought genuinely different outputs to the relationship. We could offer, potentially, a model that other worlds within the Empire might eventually find useful as precedent. He looked at me for a moment. He said, "You mean you would give the rest of the Empire an example of something outside it that works?" I said, "That would be for the Empire's member worlds to decide what to do with." He said, "You are aware that is the most politically destabilizing thing you have said today." I said, "I am aware." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good. The first draft of the Treaty of Seoul took 11 days to produce, working with Devon and 2 other imperial representatives, and our own team simultaneously. It was not the accession scroll. It was something that had never been written before, which was an agreement between the Empire and a sovereign non-member world that established specific channels of relationship without any requirement of political subordination. It covered trade in material resources, exchange in technology with agreed limitations on categories of military application, cultural exchange protocols that were entirely voluntary on both sides, and a mutual communication framework that established regular diplomatic contact without either side owing the other a response to demands. It was, in imperial legal terms, unprecedented. Devon used that word often, always with the same careful flatness. The Emperor reviewed the final draft personally. He made 3 amendments, all of them minor, and returned it. George Hartwell reviewed the amendments, accepted 2, and proposed a modification to the 3rd, which was accepted. The Treaty of Seoul was signed on the 131st day since the Herald ship first appeared in our orbit. The signing was quiet, no ceremony, at George Hartwell's request. 2 people at a table, putting their marks on a document. I watched it happen from the back of the room, and I thought about the 41-page scroll that had arrived on a Tuesday and been refused before lunch, and the 130 days between that Tuesday and this one, and everything that had happened in them. When it was done, the Emperor stood, and George Hartwell stood, and they looked at each other across the table. The Emperor said, "You should know that this document will not be popular within the throne." George Hartwell said, "I expected that." The Emperor said, "There will be questions about why this world received terms that no other world has received." George Hartwell said, "I expect there will be." The Emperor said, "Those questions will be uncomfortable for me to answer." George Hartwell said, "I imagine so." The Emperor said, "And yet here we are." George Hartwell said, "Yes, here we are." There was a pause. The Emperor picked up his coffee cup from where it had been sitting since mid-morning, found it cold, and drank it anyway. He said, "This is terrible coffee." George Hartwell said, "Yes, the machine on this floor is old. I apologize." The Emperor set the cup down. He said, very quietly, "I have governed 612 worlds. In 400 years I have never once sat in a room with someone who apologized to me for bad coffee." He looked at the cup. He said, "It is a very strange thing." Then he put on his coat and walked out. The Treaty of Seoul changed things slowly, and then all at once, the way changes always do when they have been building pressure for a long time before they finally release. The first 6 months were quiet, at least in terms of visible events. The Imperial fleet left orbit over the course of 2 weeks after the signing, the ships departing 1 or 2 at a time until only Varen's Herald vessel remained, and then that too lifted and was gone, and the sky above Earth was clear of everything except our own satellites and the stars. My name is still Oliver Grant. I am now 35 years old, and I have a new title that did not exist before this year. Director of the Office of Interstellar Relations. The office operates out of 3 buildings in Geneva and employs 412 people, which 6 months ago would have been a number I could not have conceived of for this type of work, and which already feels insufficient. The months after the treaty were not a rest. They were a shift from one kind of pressure to another kind. The emergency adaptation work that had begun during the blockade did not stop when the blockade ended. It had produced things that were genuinely useful and would have taken decades otherwise. The fusion reactor program had its first practical demonstration in a test facility in Portugal. The asteroid survey operation, launched on improvised timelines by 3 separate space agencies working in forced coordination, had returned its first detailed data sets. The emergency industrial reorganization had identified supply chain vulnerabilities that we had been ignoring for years, and was systematically addressing them. The crisis had done what crises sometimes do, which is to create the conditions for things that should have happened anyway. Within the Empire, the treaty created a different kind of pressure. We did not observe this directly at first. Our information about internal imperial dynamics came through Devon, who had become the Empire's official liaison to Earth and who was, by his own description, operating in a role that had been invented specifically for this situation, and was therefore navigated entirely without precedent or guidance. He told us, in the careful and somewhat amused way he told us most things, that the Treaty of Seoul had produced exactly the response within the Empire that the Emperor had predicted. There were questions, there were objections. There were members of the Imperial Council who found the existence of a sovereign non-member world politically intolerable, because the Empire's governance depended in part on the shared understanding that there was no alternative to membership for any world in its reach. Earth's existence as a functioning, independent civilization punched a hole in that understanding. The questions had consequences. 3 member worlds in the outer regions of the Empire, worlds that had been members for 40 and 60 years, formally requested meetings with their imperial governors to discuss the terms of their own accession agreements. They cited the Treaty of Seoul. They did not cite it as a model they expected to replicate, but as evidence that the terms of membership were apparently negotiable, which was a fact they had not previously had access to. The Emperor managed those conversations. He managed them, Davin told me, with great care and considerable frustration, and he did not, in the end, make significant concessions. But the fact that the conversations happened at all was itself significant. The framing had shifted. The certainty had a crack in it. There was a woman named Kara Linton who worked in our trade division and who spent the first 6 months after the treaty building the framework for what interstellar commerce between Earth and the Empire would actually look like in practice. The treaty had established the principle. The practice was an entirely separate challenge, involving materials that Earth had never handled, ship designs that our engineers had to understand before we could receive them, and economic structures that did not translate directly from anything in our existing frameworks. Kara worked 18-hour days for 6 months and produced a trading protocol document that Devon described as the most practically useful document he had received from any planet in 30 years. She was 29 years old and had a background in maritime trade law, which turned out, improbably, to be relevant in ways no one had anticipated. I want to talk about what happened with the other species, because it is the part of this story that I think matters most in the long view. The Empire contained 612 member worlds. Those worlds were diverse in ways that are difficult to describe, because diversity at that scale is almost incomprehensible from the perspective of a civilization that has only ever known one planet. Different biologies, different histories, different ways of understanding time and meaning and community. But they shared something that the treaty made suddenly, starkly visible. They were all inside the same system, operating under the same framework, governed by the same ultimate authority. They had, for the most part, accepted this, not without difficulty, not without their own histories of resistance and loss, but over time and generations, the fact of imperial membership had become the water they swam in. Unquestioned because unquestionable. Earth had questioned it. The information spread the way information always spreads in connected systems, not in a single announcement but through 10,000 small channels. The treaty was a public document. Its terms were available to anyone who could access the Imperial Communications Network, which included member world populations. The fact that a world had refused accession and been given something else entirely was not a secret. What member world populations did with that information varied enormously. Most of them, most of the time, did nothing with it at all, because people living within stable systems generally prioritize the stability, and the Empire, whatever its governance failures, provided a form of stability. But in the margins, in the spaces where dissatisfied populations discuss ideas that they have not yet formed into demands, the Treaty of Seoul became a reference point. It meant something, not that Earth's situation could be replicated, not that independence was available to anyone who wanted it, but that the fixed thing had moved, that someone had pushed and the system had, in a small but real way, pushed back differently than it always had before. On the 3 worlds that had requested meetings with their governors, the meetings produced modest results, small adjustments, language about cultural preservation that was somewhat more specific than the standard framework, a slight loosening of the conscription quota formula, not what Earth had, but something. Devan told me about this with his characteristic careful expression. He said the Emperor was aware of the pattern. He said the Emperor was managing it without making explicit concessions, which was a very difficult thing to do, and which the Emperor was doing with 400 years of skill. He said, "He told me recently that Earth is the most expensive experiment he has ever undertaken." I said, "Is that a complaint?" Devon considered this. He said, "I think it is an assessment. He is not a man who complains about things he chose." 6 months after the treaty, I was part of the delegation that traveled for the first time from Earth to Imperial space. We went on an Imperial ship, because we did not yet have one of our own that could make the journey, and the experience of leaving the solar system for the first time was something I do not have the language for fully, even now. I will say that it was the kind of experience that recalibrates your sense of scale in a way that is permanently altered, and cannot be undone. We went to a place called a transit hub, one of the Empire's meeting points between star systems, a structure so large that our pilot had to explain to us several times that what we were looking at was not a natural feature of space. We were there for 2 weeks, meeting with Imperial trade administrators, being assessed in ways that were both professional and, I suspect, scientific. I met a woman there named Lena Ward, who had been a xenoanthropologist before the treaty and was now the lead researcher in our interstellar studies program, and who approached every aspect of the transit hub with the specific intensity of someone who has encountered the thing they have been waiting their whole career for. She was extraordinary to watch. She asked questions with a relentlessness that our imperial hosts found startling and then, gradually, engaging. She spoke to everyone who would speak to her. She took notes on everything. She was, in the most direct sense, exactly what we had always been, looking at something new and being constitutionally unable to stop. One of the imperial administrators she spent the most time with was a species called, in their own language, something that translates roughly as the still people, a description of their communication style rather than their physical nature. They communicated primarily through long, precisely structured exchanges of information that were designed to eliminate ambiguity. Conversations with them took hours because every statement was required to be comprehensively qualified. Lena loved this. She found it delightful. She spent 6 hours in conversation with one of them, going through a topic I cannot summarize briefly, and afterward she came back to the group and said, "They have been waiting for someone to actually talk to them at full length for 40 years. I asked what she meant. She said, "Imperial communication protocols optimize for efficiency. The still people's natural communication style is the opposite of efficient, so they have been conducting all of their interactions within the Empire at about 30% of their normal depth. They have been, essentially, simplifying themselves for 4 decades because the system they are in does not have space for them at full complexity." She paused. She said, "They want to correspond with us." That correspondence became one of the more unlikely and productive scientific exchanges of the following year. The still people's accumulated knowledge, delivered at full length and full depth to people who were happy to read very long documents, turned out to contain several significant contributions to physics and materials science. Their willingness to share it with Earth specifically was, Lena believed, partly because we were not inside the imperial system that had been constraining them. We were useful to them in ways that had nothing to do with military or economic power. We were outside the structure, and outside the structure meant something different was possible. This was the pattern that repeated in various forms over the months that followed, not always dramatic, not always significant, but repeated. Earth's position as a sovereign non-member world made it a different kind of contact point for member worlds that had things they could not do, say, or exchange within the imperial framework. It was not that we were a refuge or a center of resistance. It was that we were a different kind of space, and different kinds of space turn out to be useful in ways you cannot predict in advance. There was a man named Stuart Cole who worked in our communication division, and who spent most of his days managing the flow of contact requests from member world populations. He was methodical and patient and had been a librarian before the treaty, which turned out to be perfect preparation for managing an archive of requests from 600 worlds. He processed them carefully, responded to the ones he could, flagged the ones that needed more senior attention, and at the end of each week, produced a summary report that was one of the most interesting documents in our offices. The requests were enormously varied. Some were from researchers who wanted access to Earth's scientific data. Some were from cultural organizations who wanted to establish exchange programs. Some were from individuals who had heard about Earth and wanted to know what it was like. Some were from people in difficult circumstances who had heard, through whatever channels rumors travel in interstellar civilization, that Earth was the place that had said no, and who wanted to know if that meant something for them. Stuart handled the last category with particular care. He could not offer those people what they were sometimes hoping for. Earth was not a rescue operation, and our resources were limited, and we were still in the early stages of understanding what we could and could not do in the wider context. But he answered every message. He answered them carefully and honestly, without promising what we could not provide, and without dismissing what they had written. He told me once, after reading a particular message from a world that had been part of the Empire for 60 years, that the most important thing Earth had done was not the treaty itself. It was the fact of the treaty, available for anyone to read, that showed the terms were not fixed. He said, "We didn't give them independence. We gave them the knowledge that independence was a concept the Empire knew how to negotiate with. That is a different thing, but it is not a small thing." I thought about that often in the months that followed. Devon visited Earth in person 3 times in the 6 months after the signing. His visits were official, on imperial business, but he always found time for longer conversations that were not strictly necessary for his work, which I took to mean that he found Earth interesting, in the way people find interesting the things that do not behave the way they expect. On his 3rd visit, we sat on the roof of the building in Geneva in the early evening. which was something I had never done with a diplomat from another star system, and which was strange in a quiet way that I have not stopped thinking about. The sky was clear. We could not see the Imperial ships anymore. They were not there. He said, "I want to ask you something that is not a diplomatic question." I said, "All right." He said, "When the first ship arrived, before the response was prepared, before the governments convened, in the first hours, when it was just there, were you afraid?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "Yes, not the kind of afraid that makes you run. The kind that makes you very still and very focused, because something large is happening and you want to understand it correctly." He said, "We observed that. The behavioral data from those first hours was extensively analyzed. The expected response to first contact from a pre-space civilization is a significant disruption of normal social function. We saw something different on Earth. We saw, broadly, that disruption was brief and then you organized." I said, "We have a lot of practice with large problems." He said, "We know. We studied your history extensively. We knew, before we arrived, that Earth had experienced conflicts of significant scale, environmental pressure, disease, and political fragmentation that would have broken most civilizations. You are still here." I said, "Harder to break than we look." He said, "Yes." The Emperor said something similar, though in more formal language. He said Earth was the most resilient pre-accession civilization the Empire had ever assessed, and that resilience had not been adequately weighted in the original approach. I said, "Is that a diplomatic way of saying you underestimated us?" He looked at the sky. He said, "It is a diplomatic way of saying that, yes." On a morning 2 weeks after Devon's third visit, I received a message on the secure communication channel that had been established under the treaty. It was from an address I did not recognize but which carried the authentication codes of the Imperial throne directly. The message was short. It was not on official paper, not in official format. It read as a personal note rather than a governmental communication. The sign-off was a single initial. It said, "I have reviewed the first 6 months of data from the treaty arrangement. The trade exchange is modest but growing in a pattern that my economists find more interesting than they expected. The cultural exchange protocols have produced 3 academic publications that my scientists describe as non-trivial. The member world situation is managed and within acceptable parameters, though your example continues to be a variable I am monitoring. I am told that you have an office now, with several hundred staff, and that you spend most of your time managing contact requests from across the Empire. I am told that your response rate to those requests is nearly 100%, which is a performance metric that would be unusual in any context, and is genuinely remarkable given your resources. I wanted you to know that I am aware of this. Earth is still confusing to me. I do not expect this to change, but I have found, in 400 years, that the things that confuse me longest are the things worth watching. I intend to keep watching. You should also know that the coffee at the facility where I reviewed this data is considerably better than the coffee in your building on the 5th floor. I suggest an upgrade. Regards." I read it twice. Then I smiled, which was a reaction that felt right and that I did not bother to suppress. I printed it out and put it on the wall above my desk, because it was the kind of document that should be on a wall somewhere, a note from the most powerful being in the known galaxy, unsanctioned and personal, to a diplomat in a mid-sized office in Geneva, about coffee. Later that afternoon I stood at the window and looked at the sky, the same sky that had had 16 Imperial ships in it not many months ago. Clear now, ordinary, full of clouds moving in from the west. The work was not done. It was not close to done. We had a treaty and an office and 412 people and a correspondence with the Still people and a woman named Kara, building trade protocols, and a man named Stuart answering messages from 600 worlds, and a relationship with a 400-year-old emperor who was watching us, with the specific attention of someone who finds something genuinely puzzling. The work ahead was enormous and uncertain and would require things we had not yet learned to do. I thought about George Hartwell at the table on the first day, saying no clearly and without apology. I thought about Owen with his hand-drawn map. I thought about Caroline with her pen tapping against her elbow. I thought about 8 billion people looking up and getting curious. I thought about the small crew working right now somewhere above us, in a station that had not existed a year ago, arguing about how to route a power conduit, figuring it out. That was the thing, finally. That was what I kept returning to, when the size of what we were doing pressed in too close and made it hard to breathe. We did not win because we were stronger. We did not win because we were smarter or more prepared. We won, if that was even the right word, because we were exactly and stubbornly ourselves. A species that responds to being told a thing is impossible by looking for the part of it that is not. A species that responds to pressure by organizing. A species that says no to the things it will not accept, clearly and without drama, and then gets to work on the alternative. The Emperor had looked at us and seen a variable he could not predict. He was right about that. He was going to keep being right about it for a very long time. I went back to my desk. The message was on the wall above it. The stack of contact requests waiting on my screen was 73 deep. I picked up my coffee, which was from the new machine we had ordered 2 weeks ago and which was, I had to admit, considerably better than the one on the old 5th floor. I started reading.